Well, good morning, good afternoon, good evening, depending on where you're joining us from. Thank you everyone for joining this webinar hosted by the International Telecommunications Society in partnership with TELUS Communications and the University of Toronto's Munk School of Global Affairs and Public Policy. My name is Peter Lowe and I'm the director of the Munk School, and it's really my pleasure to introduce this wonderful event we have today with Vint Cerf, who's Google's Vice President and Chief Internet evangelist. As is customary with events at the University of Toronto, I do wish to start off by acknowledging the land on which the University of Toronto operates. This land has for thousands of years been the traditional home of the Huron-Wendat, the Seneca, and the Mississaugas of the Credit. And today it's still the meeting place of people from across Turtle Island, and we're lucky and fortunate, and I hope grateful to be able to work and play in this wonderful place on this wonderful land. Today, we have the distinct pleasure, the highest honor of hearing from Vint Cerf, Google's Vice President and Chief Internet Evangelist, on the future of the Internet. And Dr. Cerf will set the stage for this discussion with comments of about 30 to 40 minutes, and then we'll turn to a Q&A for the balance of the time. I'd encourage you to put your questions into the Zoom Q&A field, and we'll get to as many of them as we can. So my only job now is to get out of the way. I'm really pleased to turn things over to Stephen Schmidt, who's the Vice President for Telecom Policy and the Chief Regulatory Legal Counsel at TELUS Communications and Chair of the International Telecommunications Society, to say a few words. Stephen, thank you so much for joining us, and the floor is yours.
Thank you, Peter. So welcome to everyone who is joining us today. We have over 750 registered participants spanning 5 continents and almost every time zone, which I think is says a lot about the stature of the speaker, the importance of the topic, and the amazing skills and promotional acumen of our hosts at the Munk School. This is the second International Telecommunications Society ITS webinar of 2022 and our 13th since the onset of the pandemic, covering topics such as 5G technology, smart cities, remote work, artificial intelligence, and more. ITS is a leading forum where academic, government, and business communities come together to share new research, to publish groundbreaking work, and to develop new approaches to the most complex and pressing issues in ICT today. And our event today is certainly no exception. For making this webinar possible, I would like to thank first and foremost, of course, our distinguished speaker, Dr. Vint Cerf, for being able to be here today, our amazing academic host, the Munk School of Global Public Affairs and Public Policy, who have been exceptional partners, our corporate host, TELUS Communications, and my TELUS colleagues, Joe Rousell and John Gannon, as well as our ITS corporate members who make events like this possible, and Dr. Sandy Levin, an ITS board member, for making the connection with Dr. Cerf and enabling our event today. And finally, to all of you from around the world, we are very grateful that you've chosen to invest your time and attention with us. In terms of today's webinar, it's not hyperbole to say that we are talking about the future of humanity when we are talking about the internet, given how pervasive and impactful the internet is in shaping our health, the environment, the economy, and society overall. The internet presents us with wonderful opportunities, as well as with difficult new problems in search of answers. Today's online world is in many ways unrecognizable from its quiet beginnings, but on the other hand, a line can nonetheless be traced from some fundamental initial design choices taken at the inception of the internet to the present state of our increasingly digital lives. And we are most fortunate to have a guide with us today who was there at the very, very beginning. Nobody is better suited to take us through this journey and help us grapple with the opportunities and challenges of tomorrow than Dr. Vint Cerf. Dr. Cerf is widely known as the father of the internet. Notably, he is the co-designer of the TCP/IP protocol and the architecture of the internet. He has been awarded the US National Medal of Technology by President Bill Clinton, the Presidential Medal of Freedom by President George Bush, as well as the ACM Alan M. Turing Award sometimes called the Nobel Prize of Computer Science. Since 2005, he has served as Vice President and Chief Internet Evangelist at Google. Dr. Cerf, the floor is yours.
Well, thank you so much, Stephen, and welcome everyone. I must say that that's quite a burden to imagine that I'm going to be speaking about the future of humanity. Gosh, I thought I was just going to talk about how to keep the internet going. One thing I will have to say is that much of what has happened over the course of the last almost 50 years now, more than 50 if you go back to the original ARPANET project, which began in 1969 to see whether packet switching was going to serve well as an intercomputer technology, intercomputer communication technology, which it demonstrated very effectively. Ironically, those of you who follow any of that history may know that email was invented in 1971 on the original ARPANET, and of course carried over into the internet. The other point I want to make is that I'm not the sole inventor of this stuff. Particularly, my colleague Robert Kahn and I have received many of those awards together. Bob is still around and still running his Corporation for National Research Initiatives. And we live just a couple of miles apart from each other. And perhaps even more amazing, one of the other fellows who's my contemporary, a man named Stephen Crocker, also lives just a couple miles away. He was the one that led the network working group that did the host protocols for the ARPANET project that preceded the internet. And so what I find astonishing is that there are still people around who were there literally at the beginning of this whole packet switching adventure. And we're still, in proximity. We still interact with each other. We still work with each other from time to time. So many, many people, not just the three that I've mentioned, but many hundreds of thousands of people deserve credit for the internet as it exists today and as it continues to evolve. So please think of us as just among the pioneers, but certainly not the sole ones for credit. I'm going to share my screen and use some slides in order to illustrate the points I'd like to make. So let's see whether I can actually make this technology work properly. Okay, something is clearly not working properly because you are not able to hear me. Should we try that one more time? This is a problem that's come up before. Can you hear me now?
We can.
Yeah. Okay. So the problem is, as soon as I turn on my slides, it thinks that the slides have audio and it cuts off my microphone. So I'll try one more time. I think there's a way to make that work properly. This is very strange. Here we go again. Oh, I see what the problem is. There we go. Now you should be able to see that. And can you hear me as well?
Yes.
We can. Yes.
Okay, yeah. The problem is there's this tiny, tiny little check mark that when you try to share your screen says share audio from the tab. And if you don't uncheck that, it mutes your microphone. Ain't software wonderful? Okay. So I call this wrestling with internet alligators because that's basically what we are all engaged in right now, is dealing with the consequences of this extremely large and complex ecosystem that has been created as the internet has evolved. And so as a reminder, even though this was billed as the future of the internet, it won't have a future unless we solve some of the problems that are staring us in the face today. And so much of what I am going to talk about is looking at problems that need to be solved, to speak a little bit to the nature of their solutions, and then spend a moment looking at the more distant future that we can anticipate. So let's start. This is my favorite theorem, number 206, which reads, everything is more complicated. And I guarantee you, the closer you look at almost anything, the more complicated it gets. So you should just keep that in mind as you start focusing on interesting problems. Let me take you back to 1969. This is what the nascent internet looked like. It was an experiment called the ARPANET, which stood for the Advanced Research Projects Agency Network, an arm of the Department of Defense that was exploring the possibility of using packet switching to support computer-to-computer communication. There are two things going on here which are very important. The first one, of course, is figuring out whether packet switching works, and the blue dots are basically packet switches. We call them interface message processors, or IMPs. But the other thing that's important are the gray boxes. Those are computers. They were time-shared machines. And what's important is that they were all made by different manufacturers: IBM, Xerox Data Systems, the Digital Equipment Corporation, and the Berkeley Computer Corporation. These all had different operating systems. They had different word sizes. They had different character encodings. So figuring out how to get them to intercommunicate in a successful way was actually a very hard problem. And that was the problem that the Network Working Group tackled. And that working group was led by Steve Crocker, whose name I mentioned earlier. So this was a successful experiment. We got those machines to communicate with each other. And then we got very excited about the possibility of using this kind of packet switching for the Defense Department's command and control system. Now, I'm skipping many years of history to show you this picture, which is actually cheating a little bit. It says Internet Now, but actually the picture was generated in 1999 from the forwarding tables of the Border Gateway Protocol. But it illustrates a couple of points. The first one is that there are many networks that are part of the internet today. They're all operated independently of each other. The operators choose what hardware and software they want to use. They choose under what terms and conditions they are going to interconnect with other network operators. They pick their own business models, could be for-profit, not-for-profit, community network, could be government-run, like the ESNet at the Department of Energy, or NASA Science Internet at NASA. All of that flexibility is theirs. There is no central control. There's no dictated terms and conditions, except that they all have to follow the same protocol suite in order to achieve interoperability. And in order to assure uniqueness of the domain name assignments and the IP address assignments, there is an organization called the Internet Corporation for Assigned Names and Numbers, which makes sure that the allocations and assignments are unique to each party. That job, by the way, was done by another colleague of ours who sadly passed away in 1998, John Postel, who used to manage the IP address space and the domain name space in it with a notebook, an ordinary, paper notebook. But quickly, as the network grew, we had to make that much more automatic. One other point to be made about the picture that you're seeing here, the reason that there are multiple networks is that Bob Kahn, my colleague in the development of the TCP/IP protocols, came to my office in 1973 at Stanford and said, "We have a problem." And I said, "What do you mean we?" And he said, "Well, the Defense Department decided that the success of the ARPANET suggests that we should be serious about using packet switching for command and control. But if we did that, we would have to figure out how to put computers in mobile vehicles, how to put them at ships at sea, how to put them in airplanes, in addition to the fixed locations that the time-shared machines of the ARPANET were occupying." So he went down a very interesting path of developing different packet switch networks to deal with the mobility question. So for the satellite, or for the ships at sea, we needed a satellite system that could cover very large distances, so ship to ship and ship to shore could be supported. And in the case of the mobile vehicles, we actually developed a packet switch mobile radio system, which functions in many ways like your mobile phone does, except that this was way back in 1974 or 1975 in the San Francisco Bay Area. So we had those three networks, ARPANET, the packet satellite network, and the packet radio network. And ironically, not far from my lab at Stanford at Xerox Palo Alto Research Center in 1973, Bob Metcalfe was inventing the Ethernet along with his colleague, David Boggs. So there were 4 packet switch technologies already either in existence or at least conceptually on the table. As Bob and I were thinking about how do you build this multi-network system and make it look consistent like one big uniform network, and that's what TCP and eventually TCP/IP did. So this is what we see today is hundreds of thousands of networks all operating concurrently and supporting traffic among several billion people. More than something like 60% of the world's population is estimated to be able to make direct use of the internet. Well, okay, so what about the problem? So this is alligator number 1, which is privacy. And so we're jumping into the deep end here without a lot of preamble of some 35 or 38 years of operation of the internet. This is one example of a challenge which has arisen. And the question here is, how do we implement access control so that things that people would like to keep private can stay private under their control by saying that only people who have the keys to the encrypted data can get access to it. And who do we know, or how do we know who it is that wants to get access? Because that's what access control is about. Who is it? What authority do they have? And what things can they get access to? And what can they do with it? Those are the kinds of questions you ask about privacy and confidentiality. So you need to have identifiers. You have to have a way of authenticating that identifier and the party that owns it. We are big fans at Google of two-factor authentication in addition to passwords, so that you have something you know and something you have, which the other party that tries to spoof you doesn't have. Strong authentication using public key crypto is important. I want to emphasize here that the idea that there is something that you have that the other party doesn't have is very important because it's possible to discover usernames and passwords, as all of you must know. The systems of the internet are vulnerable to various forms of attack, and the exposure of usernames and passwords is a frankly too common problem. So the two-factor authentication is important. The question then is, well, how do I enforce the access control? And of course, that requires the cooperation of both software and hardware. And those of you who are interested in designing secure systems will be no strangers to the idea that hardware can help reinforce software's attempt to implement enforcement of access control. And in the end, of course, we won't be 100% successful in defending against unauthorized access. And so if you're smart about designing secure systems, you'll also keep track of who had access to what. In other words, you want to keep a log of access, and then you can go back and look at it. That's what auditing is all about. Religious attention to audit is really important, because without it, you may not discover that a penetration has occurred. So the access control side of all this is really important for the enforcement of confidentiality and privacy. The second point is that there is no one place in the architecture of the internet at which you can apply all the security controls. The internet is a layered architecture, and that's an important concept for you to hang on to. The layers support each other, the lower layers supporting the upper layers. And they have the property that the interfaces between the layers have been pretty stable over the course of decades. That stability is really important because it allows you to keep changing the implementations of the interior of a layer without necessarily affecting the interactions with upper and lower layers. So one question is, where do I apply the security and privacy mechanisms? And you could do link encryption, for example, at lowest level on a point-to-point channel. You can do end-to-end encryption using public key cryptography to exchange symmetric keys and use the symmetric keys in order to do the end-to-end cryptography. You can use digital signatures in order to make sure that data has not been altered while it's in transit. You might use digital signatures to figure out where did the data come from, who generated it, who is the originator. And that might be important before you decide to accept, for example, a software update for your laptop, desktop, mobile IoT device. You want to know where did it come from and has it maintained integrity from the legitimate source. And so these are mechanisms that succeed in supporting that. At Google, we've adopted the view that all networks are compromised, including ours. We've assumed that just because you're on the corporate network does not mean that you are authorized to get access to everything. And so we don't permit access in our cloud-based systems unless you are able to show bona fides that include, for example, two-factor authentication. Sometimes this notion of having multiple layers of security is called in-depth defense, so that there are multiple things that inhibit someone's ability to penetrate the system. So if you're thinking about privacy and confidentiality, these are the kinds of things that you would want to incorporate into the ecosystem if you're building a product or a service and you want to convince the customers of that service that you are protecting their privacy and confidentiality. So I've actually gone through some of these, so I won't repeat them. But it's clear that you want to use access control and cryptography where it's appropriate. You want to make sure that in addition to the technical things that you've done, that there are legal protections for the information that you're responsible for protecting. And so there could be civil and criminal laws having to do with unauthorized access to content or its abuse. You could use contract law as a way of holding people accountable for protecting information. You might include in those contracts terms of service. These are all mechanisms for creating a legal framework in addition to the technical framework for protecting and controlling access to information. Because we talked about the technical protections and the auditing. Reagan was famous for saying, "Novarai no proverai," which doverai no provai, which basically is trust but verify. When he was thinking about a reduction of nuclear arms. And the same argument could be made with regard to protections of privacy and confidentiality. In the cloud computing world, you can imagine that this privacy and confidentiality are paramount because it's a shared environment. We have many different parties using our cloud services just as the other clouds do. And so we have to isolate all of those customers from each other and from us as well, because they want to feel that they are protected from unauthorized access by a Google person. And so we've developed capabilities that we call confidential computing, which involves the use of specialized chipsets from companies like Hewlett-Packard, AMD, and Intel. They include the ability to generate public keys and private key pairs. And so imagine for just a moment, you want to make sure that not only is your data encrypted, as it might be using HTTPS and the TCP/IP and TLS, or maybe the QUIC protocols, the recent development at Google. You encrypt the data while it's in transit. You could also encrypt the data while it's at rest. But in the case of our cloud, it's typically encrypted in a key of our creation. But now imagine for a moment that the customer can create his or her own key. And then or they can get a key that's shared only with the computer and with themselves. And so this confidential computing allows an assigned processor, which is assigned to the user, to generate a private and public key pair internally, deliver the public key and the private key to the user securely. And the user can now use the private key in order to deliver to that processor both data and software to be executed. And we can't see it because we don't know what the private key is. When the data gets to the processor, it gets decrypted and along with the program, but only when it's inside the processor, only when it's in the chip. When it leaves the chip and goes back to random access memory, it gets re-encrypted in the key that only that processor knows, and of course the user knows. So that's one way of giving users even more control over who has access to their data and their software. And there is another development which some of you probably know about. It's called homomorphic encryption. And without dwelling too deeply on this, it's a way of encrypting data so that you can process the data, perform arithmetic functions on it without decrypting it. And then when you do decrypt it, you get the right answers. And there are all kinds of arguments about how well that works and whether it's a fast or a slow process. Historically, it was a very slow process, and so it wasn't practical. But it's getting to the point now where some cryptographic methods are compatible with relatively fast processing. So that's another very, very interesting way of controlling access to data. But there are some hazards associated with this practice of using cryptography in order to achieve confidentiality. One of them is what happens if you lose the keys? And so you better have backups available and maybe even recovery procedures. One example of this is fragmenting keys. So if you have a private key, for example, for a public-private key pair, and you're nervous that you might lose it, in which case you'd lose access to all of your data, you might break the key up into different pieces, like 6, 7, or 8 pieces, and each party has a piece, but no one party can recover it. Everything, you have to have collaboration in order to recover the keys, and that, of course, you might have 5 out of 7 or 3 out of 5, so that you have the ability to recover. Of course, those parties that have pieces of key have to be trusted, because otherwise they might collude. But the idea of having multiple parties all having to collude illegally in order to recover the key inappropriately it's the multiple parties that makes that less likely. Of course, why do we have this problem in the first place with vulnerability? It's because the code is buggy. It's embarrassing. I used to make a living writing code, and I don't know about you, but I have a little dent in my forehead from all the times I've gone, God, how could I do something so stupid? When you finally figure out what mistake you've made. Unfortunately, we don't have software programming environments that will tell us when we've made stupid mistakes. And so we still have to work hard at that, despite the fact that people have been programming for over 80 years now. I've already mentioned the secure update problem. You want to make sure that you know, where did the update come from, and has it been altered in transit, in order to make sure that you don't ingest buggy code, deliberately buggy code. Malware is a big problem. There are zero-day attacks. These are vulnerabilities that have not been discovered and are suddenly applied on the 0 day and lead to penetration. We maintain something called the virus total catalog, where people report to us all the various viruses, worms, and other malware that have been encountered in the internet. We keep a catalog of all that to help people identify when something has shown up that's potentially hazardous. Phishing attacks are another one of the ways in which penetration occurs. They can be, broadcast to a large number of people to induce them to reveal the username or password or some other important piece of information. There's spear phishing, which is email that is targeted at an individual user because the attacker has sufficient knowledge about that particular user to say something which sounds credible, which sounds like it's a person you know. And of course, if they've been able to falsify the source of an email, which is not so hard to do, they can appear to be the person that you think they are, even if they're not. And they may be able to induce you to reveal information that you would not otherwise reveal. The hardest problem of all, of course, is insider attacks, people that you've already trusted and have chosen to abuse that trust. That's why auditing is such an important practice, because you want to be able to observe what people have done, what data they've gotten access to, maybe what they've done with it. And again, you need to teach people to be aware of insider attacks. Sometimes they're executed by what's called social engineering, where you rush up to somebody and say, oh, I'm responsible for this system and it's crashing and I don't remember the key, but you have it. Can you help me before all of our customers go away? This sort of social engineering is not uncommon, and people need to be trained to detect that and not respond to it. And finally, and much more generally, I think the public needs to be aware of the risk factors of being online. They need to learn how to do safe networking, so to speak. And that fits into the more general rubric of digital literacy. So now I think I want to mention one other thing, which is we've been talking mostly about the edges of the net, where the application spaces are, where the clouds are, where your mobiles and laptops are. But the underlying network itself also is challenged with regard to safety and security. And so although this is not intended to be a detailed training program on how to build a secure network, I just want to mention the existence of challenges at the core of the system that have to be addressed in order for us to increase our level of trust in the network itself. And so knowing where did something come from, is the IP address a legitimate address, and has it been properly applied to the packet that's arriving? Can I validate, can I register those addresses so that it is known which parties have the authority to issue packets with that source address? How do I validate that? Can I figure out whether or not a particular autonomous system, a particular network, is allowed to use the particular set of IP addresses as originating IP addresses when they send traffic out into the network? How do I know that it's coming from a legitimate authority? There is an effort by the Internet Society to get all the parties who build networks and interconnect them in the Internet to adopt a set of norms for routing security to make sure that the routes in the network are legitimate, as opposed to being attempts to to cause the routing system to deliver traffic to the wrong place. And so this border gateway protocol path validation is an example of making sure that the announcements of ownership of IP addresses are legitimate. The Internet routing registries are another place where that kind of information can be recorded. You can use it to check to see whether the routing updates are coming from legitimate sources. If you are an ISP and someone is sending a packet into your network, but it has a source address which is not one that you're responsible for, that's a spoof. And so the ISP should be detecting that and throwing the traffic away, and maybe even tracking down the parties who are trying to falsify the source address. The reason that's a bad problem is that if you falsify the source address to be the address of a target that you want to launch a denial of service attack for, you could send a query, for example, to the domain name system and have it respond to the target. And if you get enough domain name system components all responding to the target, you might overwhelm them in a denial of service attack. We can use transport layer security, which I mentioned earlier, to encrypt traffic on top of TCP in order to protect it while it's in transit. I mentioned the quick protocols are an alternative to TCP TLS, which has some nice properties to it. And of course, at the IP layer, there's such a thing as IPsec. These are all tools that are available for increasing the safety and security of the network itself. Well, there's a lot of unfinished business associated with the internet, and I want to just draw your attention to some of these things. And again, I want to reiterate the reason I'm emphasizing all this is that we won't really have much of a future if we don't solve some of these problems successfully. Now, many of you may remember that there was a major piece of Westphalia, which there were three different major treaties that were agreed, and they settled scores of disputes among countries and municipalities. This was literally 350 years ago. And that settled the idea that nation states had a boundary, a geographic boundary, and that within that boundary they had full authority of law. That they had autonomy and sovereignty within those borders. And this was a concept which helped countries agree not to interfere with each other's internal affairs. But the internet doesn't quite work that way because it doesn't notice when the packets have crossed international boundaries. It was designed not to notice that. So packets don't realize when they cross from Spain to France, for example. And the consequence of all that is that the internet doesn't fall well into the notion of these autonomous regions. The internet autonomy is topological, but it is not geographical. The consequence of this is that some countries are saying, well, with all the big problems there are on the internet with denial of service attacks and misinformation and disinformation, we want to build borders around our piece of the internet. And as you'll see this, of course, in the Chinese Great Firewall is a common phrase. And frankly, Russia is also trying to do that. And other countries have reached the conclusion they want data sovereignty. I don't think that's the right model. I don't think that building a barrier around a piece of the internet is the right answer. The right answer is to do what we talked about earlier, which is encrypt data that you care about controlling access to, and let that be the way in which you represent data sovereignty, which is protecting the data from access unless an unauthorized party can exhibit bona fides and possibly have keys for decrypting. There are huge issues associated with the content on the internet, and some organizations in some countries are saying that content needs to be filtered. I suspect that those of you who think about this might recognize that the decision to filter content is a pretty important one, because it gets in the way of freedom of speech. Now, not all countries have the same view of freedom of speech, but here in the United States, where I live, freedom of speech is considered to be an extremely important right. And we try very hard to maintain that so that people have the freedom to speak their views and others have the freedom to hear their views. They don't have to agree with them, of course. Nonetheless, there's also issues associated with content that's harmful. For example, during the pandemic, misinformation about the treatment of the pandemic is harmful to the general public. And so you can see how the question of content filtering is not a trivial one. And making decisions about how to cope with that is turning out to be really hard. That leads to another point, which is about ethics. And here, I just to be brief about it, I think that those of us who create software and hardware that's used to implement pieces of the internet or the applications that run on it have an ethical responsibility to help people be and feel and be protected in the online environment, and that we should teach programmers and others that they have an ethical responsibility to achieve that objective. I'm concerned about time here, and so in this slide, I'm not going to try to speak to every single one of the points, but I want to emphasize that international agreements are going to be needed in order to provide protection against harm in the online environment. The reason is that the perpetrators can be in one jurisdiction and the victims in another. In this internet, which is global in scope and insensitive to crossing international boundaries by design. So there are a variety of things that are listed here that need to be, I would say, pursued in order to assist in dealing with holding people accountable for their harmful behavior. And because of the jurisdictional boundary question, it's going to require cooperation and collaboration. And so there is a lot of work going on right now trying to develop norms for this kind of collaborative protection of citizens from harm. And well, by good fortune, that was the last slide. And some of you will say, yeah, but what about the future? So I'm going to give you two glimpses of the future that I think both of which are quite predictable. And I'm going to get rid of the slides here because I don't have a slide addressing this. So I want to come back to you so I can see what's going on here. Okay, so two things for you to think about. One of them is that you've heard of the Internet of Things. These are programmable devices that can communicate with each other over the internet. They are going to become so numerous that there will be more of them than there are people on the planet. And already in some very informal discussions, we've discovered that some people at Google have 40 or 50 devices at home. I did an inventory of all of the things hanging on my Wi-Fi and discovered about 40 devices, 2 of which were in the sock drawer that I'd forgotten about. So we need to protect the IoT devices because there will be many of them. And if they're not properly configured, they may become avenues for invasion of privacy or for denial of service attacks. I used to tell a joke. I used to say, well, you know, the headline I'm trying to defend against is 100,000 refrigerators attacking Bank of America. And I don't laugh at that joke anymore because some of you will remember that the Dyn Corporation was attacked by 500,000 webcams that were invaded because they didn't have any security. And they were launching megabit streams at the target. And when you do the math, it's many billions of bits per second. And it knocked the Dyn Corporation over, which wasn't so serious, except they were responsible for doing domain name services for a whole bunch of very famous companies, which suddenly disappeared off the net because DynCorp couldn't serve the domain name lookups. So there were cascade failures. Some of you who know about the Colonial Pipeline attack know that that ransomware attack took the Colonial Pipeline out of operation, and for a week there wasn't any gas on the East Coast, and that had massive cascade effects. So the thing that we're worried about is that the IoT devices be thoughtfully created, constructed, maintained, updated when bugs are found in order to prevent their use in abusive behaviors. The second thing to mention briefly is that there has been, since 1998, an effort to develop an interplanetary extension of the internet. It started at the Jet Propulsion Laboratory by a small team that I worked with and have continued to work with in the interim. Our prototype software was actually used to support the rovers that landed on Mars in 2004 that required a new networking capability to communicate back to Earth other than direct to Earth path. We had to reprogram the orbiters that had mapped the surface of Mars to figure out where the rovers were going to go. They were reprogrammed to be store and forward relays, packet switching in other words, in order to support our command of the rovers and our ability to get data back. Everything that's landed on Mars, at least from the US, has been served with this store and forward interplanetary backbone, small but critical backbone capability. The interplanetary protocols have now been standardized by the Internet Engineering Task Force and by the Consultative Committee on Space Data Systems, which is made up of all the spacefaring countries around the world. The protocols are going to be, they're already on the International Space Station. They've been tested in space. They're continuing to be tested terrestrially at scale, and they will be available for the return to the moon in the Artemis and Gateway missions launched by NASA and by others, ESA, JAXA, and CARI, and some of the other spacefaring nations. So the future of the internet is off planet in addition to its continued use here. And I'll stop there, Peter and Stephen, and we can, if there's time, I'm happy to try to answer questions.
And thank you so much for that. We do have lots of questions, and what I like about them, selfishly, is that some of them are the questions that I have. So let's start with kind of a basic one, and we'll go from there. Can you kind of walk us through what the impact of quantum computing could be in terms of current validation techniques,
Sure.
and then kind of the general security of the internet?
Happy to do that. The threat here is that many of the cryptography methods, public key cryptography methods, are based on the difficulty of factoring the products of large primes. And there is an algorithm called Shor's algorithm, which has been invented but never demonstrated on a real quantum machine, because nobody has one yet that could run the algorithm in a useful way. But the threat is that at some point, quantum algorithms could be used to essentially discover what the two primes are, and therefore break the public key cryptography. The National Institute of Standards and Technology in the US invited proposals for post-quantum crypto algorithms that do not suffer from that weakness. They got 36 proposals back. They winnowed it down to 3. And so it's already the case that alternatives to public key crypto are on the table. In addition to which, extending the key size, the public key size, is a way of defending against even a quantum computer for a while. So I anticipate that we will have solutions to that problem, certainly within this year, or certainly next year.
You've spoken to a little bit, and we've got lots of questions about this kind of notion of multiple internets, and in the divide between democracies and autocracies, the idea that certainly what citizens see are often different internets in some sense, because there's serious controls on content that differ between countries. But can you just walk us through a bit more about what the potential is for how deep that metaphor can go? Can we actually see ourselves getting to a place where we've got, at the level of infrastructure, really two separate internets? And I mean, and if so, what's the prospect for the internet that's being built in the West, so to speak, to be the one that is dominant?
Well, certainly, if we end up if we ever end up with different internets, it'll be 193 of them, most likely. Every country is going to insist. This is the data sovereignty argument again. We want full control over anything that happens on our piece of the internet, end of story. And in a way, it is end of story, because the whole idea of being able to move data back and forth freely through this global network has been vital to the support for commerce, the support for science, the support for education. I mean, think of all the things that we have been doing, especially for the past 2 years. They are all very heavily dependent on freedom of flow of data. And for people who say, but the reason I'm so concerned about this is that I don't want people to get access to data. I want it to stay physically here in my country, as if it were safer there, which it isn't. Then my response to that is, please make use of cryptographic methods to protect access to the information, grant access to that information only to parties you trust, rather than interfering with the ability of the internet to move data back and forth freely. It's pretty hard to run a cloud computing system if you're not allowed to move data back and forth, because at Google anyway, we copy data from one data center to another so that there's backup. And if a whole data center goes away, we want no one to be harmed by that, because we've replicated the data at other data centers. But you can't do that unless you have free flow of the content back and forth among the data centers. So that's very important for us and others who offer cloud services. There are lots of other ways in which the internet looks different from one place to another. And so your point's well taken, that if this continues to evolve, we may not end up with the ability to find the same information, which is what the original intent was. No matter where you are on the internet, you should be able to get to the same place. So I'm hoping that alternatives to slicing the internet up into pieces will be persuasive, and that countries will recognize that they don't want to lose the value of an open internet, which has delivered so much to us over the past 35 years.
We're going kind of rapid fire here, Vint, but time is of the essence. So I'd love to hear, and others would love to hear your thoughts about kind of the future of the internet and energy consumption. We hear a lot about the increasing energy toll of the internet and through crypto mining, but other things as well. Can you just and for me, it's hard to wrap my head around what that looks like in the future as computing gets more efficient, but we use it more. So can you just give us a sense of how to think about the internet usage and data usage and energy consumption in the future?
Well, first of all, I wouldn't blame internet on Bitcoin or whatever, or Bitcoin on internet. I guess that's I don't particularly like the proof of work technique because it is so consumptive of energy. This doesn't mean that all blockchains are bad, but some of them are worse than others. And so I would be cautious about that. The data centers are getting more and more efficient over time. There is an economy of scale, and we at Google and others are investing heavily in reducing power requirements. One of the most interesting propositions is the use of Josephson junctions, which I'm sure many of you will remember were an interesting phenomenon. They're cryogenic, but they require extremely low power in order to operate, except for the fact that you have to keep them at a very low temperature. So the question then is the cryogenics so overwhelmingly expensive from the energy point of view that it nullifies the low power requirements for maintaining a Josephson junction-based computing system? And I'm drawing on knowledge from Ivan Sutherland, who is at the University of South of your Oregon, who is an expert in this area. I'm not. But the fact is that we have been persistently driving power requirements away or out of computing over time. We've also used techniques like content distribution networks in order to reduce the need to transmit data back and forth. So my view is that the argument that somehow computing is going to eat us out of power is, I think, overblown. And I don't see it as the major contributor to energy consumption. The major contributors are buildings, manufacturing facilities, electric vehicles, and so on.
Let me ask you a question about our capacity, in a sense, our capacity to understand the internet. And this is a question from one of our fellows here at Monk, Graham Moffat, and he asks, as AI-assisted coding and network management becomes more prevalent, will humans still be able to understand and address vulnerabilities, or does this turn into kind of a supervision problem where we really aren't sure how the internet is developing as we rely on AI to develop it?
Well, first of all, I would say the internet is a big, complex thing. It's made up of an unbelievable amount of software, all interacting with each other. In many cases, there are interactions that have never happened in the history of man that occur, millions of times a day, from complements of software that never talked to each other before and suddenly did. So the complexity of the system is very big. It's hard to imagine understanding all of it. AI in machine learning is all about statistics right now. It is looking for stable representations of a statistical universe. I worry a little bit that we are going to hand over to some of these machine learning algorithms more responsibility than they should have, partly because they are often brittle in the sense that they're very narrow and they're really good in their narrow niche. And then when they're confronted with something they've never experienced before, they break. So my view right now is that we should be very careful about relying too much on machine learning, although it can be extremely helpful in specific applications. But I see the internet as, despite the fact that we can't necessarily understand all of it all at once in its entirety, we don't have to, because it's organized in such a way that it has identifiable parts, and those parts are manageable.
Let me ask you one final question.
I can't hear you, Peter.
Oh, sorry. Can you hear me now?
Yes, I can.
Pardon me. I think I pressed the mute button twice. Let me ask you one final question. I ask it as sitting in my perch as a director of a school of public policy and global affairs. And it is about kind of the role of, in your view, the role of big corporations and technology in helping to shape the internet. And we're at a time where the world is seeing conflict in a way that it has not. The world's been in conflict perpetually, but we're seeing conflict in ways we've not seen for a long time. And kind of underwriting that conflict really is a battle of ideas in the world about autocracies versus democracies. There is different views in the world about information and how it should be shared and what the relationship of citizens to the state should be, et cetera, et cetera. And then there's the use of technology as a weapon of war. What's your sense of where big companies like Google and other technology firms will come down in this series of conflicts, and it's sort of in the future conflict between autocracies and democracies to not only make the internet safe for people, but to further the cause of human rights and further the cause of a peaceful world?
So, certainly companies like ours, Google, still adheres to its primary motto, which is to organize the world's information and make it universally accessible and useful. We desire to achieve that objective, and most of our products and services are contributing to that. I think that we are responsible, not only at Google, but the other companies that make products and services that either support the internet or provide services on it, have a responsibility to be responsible in their development of these products and services. They need to be thinking about users' protection of users' interests, rights, and safety, and privacy and confidentiality. So we should be held accountable for that. At the same time, though, I can tell you that different countries have different views of the role of companies like ours and others, and those views are in conflict. And the consequence of that is that it's hard to operate as a global entity to try to satisfy conflicting demands that come from various national sources. So figuring out how to keep the utility of the internet while protecting people from harm is our primary challenge. How do we do that so that we don't lose the value of the internet, but people feel and are safe in its use?
Vint, I want to thank you very, very much for joining us. It's been a distinct pleasure for me, I know, and if everyone's found it as informative and educational as I have, we're all very, very much better for the time you've so generously given us. I want to thank Stephen Schmidt and TELUS Communications as well, and the International Telecommunications Society for making this possible. And I want to thank the hundreds of you who joined us this morning to learn more about the future of the internet. Vint, I hope we can have you back at the Munk School of Global Affairs and Public Policy sometime, maybe even in person. But until then, thanks so much for joining us.
Well, I would look forward to an in-person visit, and next time I would suggest I will speak less and do more Q&A.
Any mix is fine with us. Thanks so much, Vint, and thanks so many of you for joining us, and thank you, TELUS.
Thanks again. Bye-bye for now. Have a great day.
Cheers.